Once again today we have the occasion of the apostles desiring to have this worldly glory. We have James and John going to Jesus and asking, can we sit at your right and at your left, those places of honor? And of course Jesus responds, for that is not something I can give, that is instead for my Father to give. He then asks them the questions, are you willing to be baptized and drink the cup that I present? And they say we are, and so he says this is true. They will drink the cup. Of course, we know the cup of martyrdom for James. They'll be baptized in Christ and live out his life. But as they do this, of course, we know that their fellow apostles become indignant at them. They say, what are you doing? Why do you ask him this question? And Jesus hears them, and so he says to them, you know that those who are recognized as rulers over the Gentiles lord it over them. But it shall not be so among you. Whoever wishes to be great among you will be your servant. And we know this. We know that Jesus came not to be served, but to serve. He goes on to say, whoever wishes to be first among you will be the slave of all. What does it mean to be a slave? To be a slave would mean that you have no rights and that you're the possession of someone else. And so Jesus says to them, whoever wishes to be first among you will be the slave of all. And he wants us, essentially what he's saying is, he says, I want you to be a slave to who? A slave to God. You know, there's a beautiful book out there. It was written in 1973. And the name of the book is called From Slave to Priest. And it tells the story of the first African-American priest that got ordained in America. This priest's name was Father Augustine Tolton. Father Augustus was born in 1854 in Missouri, was born on a plantation to his parents, Martha and Peter. Martha and Peter were slaves as well, and they were baptized Catholics, married in the Catholic Church. And so when Augustus was born, he was born as a slave. He had a sibling named Charlie, and a younger daughter, I believe her name was Claire as well. And so it was Charlie, Augustus, and Claire, and the parents Martha and Peter. In 1860, Peter escaped the plantation and went to go serve in the Union Army, because the Civil War was about to break out, or already had broken out. In 1861, Martha, seeing that slave traders were coming and buying children, realized that she had to get her children off the property. And so they escaped one night. And they went eventually to Quincy, Illinois. Quincy was a major stop in the Underground Railroad, and this is where they settled in 1861. As soon as they settled, they got housed up with an ex-slave took them in, and they started to live together as a family. Unfortunately, Peter, Augustus' dad, passed away right away when he left. He actually got an infection and passed away, but Martha and the children did not know this until 1867. Augustus and Charlie and Martha went to work immediately when they got to Quincy, Illinois. They worked in a tobacco factory making cigars 9 months a year. 6 days a week for 10 hours. At 8 a.m., the bell would ring, and at 6 p.m., it would shut down. Augustus was always by his mother's side, as was Charlie as well. At the age of 10, Charlie passed away. He was a sickly child. He passed away. And when the tobacco factory shut down for the winter, Augustus went to school. They'd been going to Sunday Mass at St. Boniface Parish, and so they wanted to enroll Augustus into school at St. Boniface as a young child at the age of 8. Augustus went to school for a month. You can imagine in the 1860s, an African-American in an all-white school. The teachers accepted him, the priests accepted him, but the parishioners and fellow students did not. It got to the point that parishioners were not only threatening to leave the parish, they were threatening to leave the Catholic faith and writing the bishop because of young Gus being in the same school as their children. It was a mutual agreement between the pastor and Martha that they would withdraw Augustus from school. The pastor said that was the hardest thing he ever had to do as a pastor, and the saddest moment of his life. Augustus went back to work, of course, at the tobacco factory, and eventually another parish opened up, St. Peter's in Quincy, Illinois. The new pastor there had heard about Augustus, had seen Augustus at Mass every single Sunday, and said, we should put him in school. And he said, I don't care if parishioners don't like it or not. Young Gus needs to be formally educated. And so Gus started going to school 3 months a year when the tobacco factory was shut down. He received his first communion and confirmation at the age of 16, and eventually had the same education as a basic 8th grader would. This was phenomenal for an African American of the time. Although the priests saw something different in Gus. They saw that he had a great devotion. And so they asked young Augustine, do you want to become a priest? And he said, I'd like to look into that. And so they applied to every single seminary in the United States for Augustine. And not one seminary accepted him. They were not willing to accept an African-American seminarian. They thought it would have a negative impact on the seminary and other people as well. And so this happened for 7 years. The priest of Quincy, all the priests gathering, would tutor young Gus, teach him Latin and philosophy, and continue to look for avenues of him to join the seminary. The bishop of the town, eventually Springfield, Illinois, decided that he too wanted him to go to seminary, but they could not find one. Eventually, after 7 years, Augustine, at the kind of movement and the Holy Spirit inspiration, was accepted into a seminary in Rome for the propaganda of the faith. This is a mission organization. It was the bishop of Springfield who sent and finally made connections, but there's a caveat here. Augustine would be a missionary throughout the whole world. And he would no longer be located in Illinois and no longer be located in the United States. Augustine actually was very happy about this. The reason why is because his whole life he had been denied. He had been denied from his school. He had been denied from seminaries. He felt, in a certain sense, denied that even though he had a vocation, people could not see it here in America. So he went to Rome and got there in 1880. And for 6 years he studied for the priesthood. And the whole time he thought for sure he was going to be sent to Africa. He made a vow of obedience that he would go wherever the cardinal prefect decided to send him. And it was on Good Friday, 1886, the day before Augustine got ordained a priest, that the cardinal called him in and reminded him and said, Augustine, remember the promise that you made, that you'll go wherever I decide to send you? And Augustine says, yes, and essentially I'm willing to go to Africa. I'm ready to go to Africa. And the cardinal said, that was the recommendation of the committee, but I'm sending you back to America. I'm sending you to Quincy, Illinois, your hometown. And Augustine was heartbroken. He didn't want to go back. It wasn't his desire. And yet he knew that he took that vow of obedience, that he was called to go wherever the Lord sent him. And so the vow of obedience, he said, yes. The next day he got ordained, and the day after that he celebrated Mass at St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. His altar server was the cardinal. How amazing that is. Eventually, Father Augustine Tolton got back to America. And eventually he got back to Quincy, Illinois, and got his own parish. His parish was St. Joseph in Quincy, Illinois, and it was meant to kind of be that, we kind of see it now, a national parish. This was set up in St. Paul as well. There was a German parish, the Irish parish, the French parish. Well, his parish was the African American parish. They called it the colored parish back then. This parish was a block away from another parish as well, and people wanted to come and see this first African American priest in America. And so people would come from near and far, hear him preach, hear him sing, go to confession to him. Blacks and whites, everyone would come, and he simply served everyone. He wanted to be a minister, he wanted to be a pastor to all. He didn't see any restrictions at all. For 3 years, he labored as the pastor there at St. Joe's in Quincy, Illinois. Of course, he had great success and also great hardships as well. But it was in 1889 that something tragic happened to Father Augustine Tolton. a new pastor came into town in Quincy, Illinois, and he was the dean of the clergy. At that time, there was 4 parishes in Quincy, Illinois, and this pastor was kind of in charge of them all. And he came to a parish that had a huge debt, and he looked at Father Augustus's parish, St. Joseph, and said, some of my parishioners are going there. It's only a block away from his own parish. And he says, they're giving money that belongs to our parish. They're giving money that belongs to this, and we're in debt. And so he started preaching against Father Augustus and told his own parishioners, if you go there, essentially what you're doing is committing a sin. You have an obligation to be here. Territorial parish. That still happens today as well every once in a while. This, of course, caused Augustus great stress, and it caused some great discord as well. That pastor essentially said, you should leave Quincy, Illinois. And Augustus decided, well, I don't think the Lord's calling me to do that, but he submitted it to the bishop. And the bishop at this time said, I think you're actually needed in Chicago. And so Augustus left his hometown of Quincy, Illinois, and went to Chicago. Of course, the parish in Chicago that he went to, St. Monica's parish, was very, very, very excited that now they had this Father Augustine Tolton there. This, once again, was a national parish set up for the African Americans, and there were 600 families there. At the time, I believe there was 25,000 African Americans living in Chicago, and Augustus was called to be the pastor to them all. From 1889, Augustus labored tirelessly in the ghettos of Chicago. It truly was a poverty-stricken area. The African Americans had no money at all, but Augustus was there to serve them and to be a minister to each and every one of them. In 1897, Augustus went on a retreat with the fellow priests of the Archdiocese of Chicago. By this time, his health had started to weaken. He had worn himself thin. He had given everything he had to the parish. When he arrived back on July 9th, 1897, it was 105 degrees outside. Augustus fell on the street, passed away of heat stroke, and eventually passed away at Mercy Hospital. His funeral was 2 days later at a parish in Chicago. 100 priests were there to celebrate his funeral. And eventually his body was taken back to St. Peter's in Quincy, Illinois, where you can still go visit there today. And he's buried in the parish cemetery as a priest. Not segregated, but simply as a priest. We look at Father Augustus Tolton's life and we see, who was he? He was born a slave, he was ordained a priest, and he became a slave for all. He wanted the Lord, he wanted God to be his master. In 2011, Cardinal Francis George of the Archdiocese of Chicago opened up the case for canonization for Father Augustus Tolton. In 2014, they finished the investigation and sent it off to Rome. Right now, it's sitting in Rome and waiting for them to make a decision if they're going to continue the case on for beatification or not. But now Father Augustus Tolton is known as a servant of God. The investigation, of course, saw that he lived a holy life, a life full of virtue, a life full of service to God. The reason he's going on for canonization, hopefully, is not because he's the first African-American priest, but rather because he lived out this gospel message. Whoever wishes to be first among you is called to be a slave of all. Let's follow in Father Augustus Tolton's footsteps. Let's put our own self-interest behind. Let's not try to be our own master, but instead go to the Lord, go to God and say, God, I am here to serve you. I'm here to be your slave, and I want you to be my master.